So welcome back. This week has gone very quickly. So I did a lecture just last week, and on Botticelli, and I see lots of familiar faces. So thank you for coming back in such numbers to hear about a slightly more obscure artist, Fra Angelico. So just my normal notes here at the beginning. We do all of the wires. We do film and record all our lectures, and they're posted just within a few days on our website. And our cards are on the table, and you just go to media, and then it's Jones Gallery Lecture Series, and they're all there. They're starting to pile up. It's very exciting. I look at it daily, and look at our little collection. I hope it just goes on for pages and pages. Oh, poor Caleb. He's the one who has to edit. He edits them all, and then he has his headphones in, and he'll recite me back to me, and I'm like, don't, stop it. Yes, so we're trying our kind of our grand mission with this is to make art history and kind of the really attentive looking at art as accessible as possible and to the widest possible audience. So we do, to that end, we do have a donation bucket at the back. So we gratefully accept donations, and it goes directly into the research and the techie component of the lecture series. And I think that's it. Announcements over. Yes. Yes. So welcome tonight. I am so excited about this one. This is my favorite art space in Florence. We'll be talking about the San Marco Monastery and the work of Fra Angelico. And like Botticelli, as I was speaking last week, Fra Angelico was one of these artists where he didn't really, and his work didn't captivate me so much. I was a little more interested in artists like Leonardo and Masaccio, and I'll talk about why tonight. And I've kind of never really spent a lot of time researching or looking in a really careful way at the work of Fra Angelico. And so I went for the first time to the convent of San Marco, and it blew me away. I feel like I say this every time. This artist blew me away, or this artist knocked my socks off, but this really did. I'm telling the truth this time. The work of Fra Angelico in San Marco was really, truly spectacular, and I thought a really special moment of why seeing art in its context is really important, and what that putting art in its context can say about the work, and it can translate, I think, perhaps a little better than just something flatly in a book can. So I'm hoping to bring that to life for you tonight a bit. And so, like I said, we'll be talking about Fra Angelico, and they're his dates. So he's very much an artist of the early Italian Renaissance. And we'll be also talking about, this is the juicy stuff, I teased you with it last week, about Savonarola, a radical monk who essentially took over the religious and political power in Florence, drove out the Medicis, burned a bunch of stuff, and then he burned himself. So, I mean, he didn't burn himself. I mean, he eventually burned, whatever. We'll get there. We'll get there, and I'll tell the story. So I teased you a bit with that last week and said if you want to get to more of the Savonarola story, you have to sit through the Fra Angelico stuff first, and then we'll talk about Savonarola. But why I've paired them together is that they were both inhabitants of San Marco. They're the two most famous inhabitants. And the contrast between these figures is so striking that Fra Angelico is this actually wasn't his name when he joined the convent. His birth name was Piero Giuliani Piero. There was a John and a Peter and just kind of a regular Italian name, and he joined the Dominican order. So it's a begging order, an order that avows chastity and poverty. And he became known there as Fra Giovanni, so Brother John. But he was so pious and so dedicated to his work. And there's a story that Vasari tells. And Vasari was an early biographer. He was one of the first biographers of these Renaissance artists, so he knew many of them. He would sometimes make things up, so he would, there's always a note in our history books, according to Vasari, this may or may not be true, but Anyway, so Vasari is sometimes an unreliable narrator. But according to Vasari, Fra Angelico would weep anytime he painted the crucifixion. He was so moved by the story of Christ. So an extraordinarily pious and devout person. And he became known no longer as Fra Giovanni within the monastery, and then in a wider setting, he became known as Fra Angelico, which is the angelic brother, right? The angelic friar. As opposed to Savonarola, who was really quite monstrous and preached kind of hell and damnation and fire, and the end times were coming, and he had little bands of roving children that would steal things from people's houses and throw them into the fire. He was like something out of Game of Thrones. Okay, really a terrifyingly horrific person, but they both emerged from San Marco. And just to provide you with a bit of context, this is San Marco. It's a little farther afield. Like you're kind of walking by the Duomo, and then you walk by the Accademia, and that's where you see the David, and then you have to keep walking, and then eventually you'll get to This is really awful. It's a terrible square. It's like a bus station. So there's all of these buses kind of swirling around the front of San Marco, but this is it. And now you can go into the church itself, and then you can also go into the museum, the Museum of San Marco, and then that will lead you. Oh, you pop out the backside of San Marco, and it's just like, oh, I love this. This is so Italian, right? That sounds cliche to say, but it's like, the guys and the smoking and the Vespas and the graffiti and the stuff, and like housed in there is like, like this incredible masterpiece of Western civilization, and it's, like it looks so nondescript from the exterior. So anyway, that's the back end of San Marco. And this is looking into the garden, looking into the cloisters here, and I'll be talking about kind of what's in all of these rooms here tonight. But the story of San Marco as the monastery is that in the early 1400s, it was in a very sorry state of disrepair. And and this is the garden. Sorry, my slide. I gotta stay on one story before I move on. This is the garden. It's a really lovely place to visit. I think I said that last week about San Lorenzo. You'll be adding all the sand places to your list. But it's typical of this type of monastery that it has a meditative space in the interior. So it's a very it's sheltered kind of from the hustle and bustle of Florence on the outside, and you enter in through the museum, and then you come out into a space like this. Okay, now I can carry on with my story. So in the early 1400s, San Marco Monastery was in a terrible state of disrepair, and was badly needing an inflow of capital to do all the repairs. And luckily for San Marco, this person, we talked about him last week, Cosimo de' Medici. So he's known as Cosimo il Vecchio, so Cosimo the Elder. So he's kind of the founder of this Medici clan. They're an vastly, enormously wealthy family in Florence, and they reshaped the Florentine Renaissance. Probably couldn't happen without the influx of their taste and their wealth into kind of civic projects and building projects, and then art commissions as well. They obtained all of their money through Cosimo did. Cosimo founded the banking system. So they became the bankers to the papacy. So lots of money flowing into the Medici family, and this is their family crest, which I showed you last week. So the kind of the gold, the red spheres on a gold background. This is the Palazzo Medici. And the Palazzo Medici is actually quite near San Marco, so it's kind of in that district, that area. So it kind of fell within the Medici kind of parish or Medici environment. And the Pope at the time, Pope Eugene the Fourth, had this ingenious idea that he could essentially guilt trip Cosimo de' Medici into completely redoing San Marco. Because you probably have heard this elsewhere in your travels, but for Catholics, the earning of interest on loaned money is actually a cardinal sin. It's called usury, and in the 1430s, Cosimo was starting to feel some pricklings of conscience that he was earning his vast wealth and aggrandizing his family fortune through interest. And he was like, oh, I might go to hell for this. And he didn't want to go to hell, obviously. So he said to Pope Eugene, Pope Eugene, what can I do so that I can ensure my way to heaven and make amends for the sin of usury? And Eugene, in a stroke of genius, said, you know what you should do? You should rebuild San Marco. Wouldn't that be great? And so luckily for San Marco, Cosimo thought that was a grand idea because, one, he could hopefully save his soul from purgatory and hell and do a very pious act for the Catholic Church. But also, true to form for the Medicis, thought, this would be a great way to augment the family name, and it was another kind of ostentatious demonstration of their wealth and power. They stamped the Medici crest everywhere in San Marco. We talked about this last week too, that there was a joke that a contemporary said at a time that even the Medicis would stamp their balls even in the privies. Anyway. Yes, so they were very aware of corporate branding and kind of corporate marketing, and so you see those, like, just keep an eye out. It's not just in San Marco; it's everywhere. Keep an eye out for. Sometimes it's not colored. Sometimes it's just in the stone, which I'll show you. And so the Medicis poured an incredible amount of wealth into the reconstruction of San Marco and also the redecoration. And they restructured the entire cloisters area and built a number of cells for all of the monks that lived there. And Cosimo, in fact, he was very connected to this church. It was kind of part of their cynosure. So it was part of their kind of the focus of their admiration and attention, that he set aside 2 of the cells in San Marco as the Medici cells. So he would go there. It was a kind of a space of personal piety for him. He would go and spend time himself in the cells. So the Medicis were intimately woven or intimately connected to San Marco, which gets really interesting when we come along to Savonarola. So Cosimo would actually spend time here in kind of an act of piety throughout his life. So this is just to kind of give you a sense of how the space works. This is the church, and then what we're going to be looking at tonight are there's all of these rows of cells, and part of the rebuilding of the church, or redecoration of the church. The Medici, Cosimo, hired his favorite architect named Michelozzo and gave him thousands of florins, but then he also hired artists to do the decoration of the church and the convent and at this area here. And one of the artists that he hired was Fra Angelico. And there's a which I'll show you tonight, there is a fresco by Fra Angelico inside each one of these cells. There's a total of 43 cells with small frescoes. And then there's paintings by Fra Angelico throughout the entirety of San Marco. This is a library that extends here. But what I'd like to focus on tonight is you go in through the entrance, and you wander through the garden, and then you pop up this set of stairs here, and the first thing you see as you're coming up the stairs is this painting, and it's absolutely remarkable. And that's what I'll spend a few minutes here tonight talking just specifically about this painting and what makes it so special. And this is one of Fra Angelico's frescoes. It's not in the cell. It's kind of in the entrance to the private space, the entrance into the monastic space. So it would have been meant for an audience of the monks, so the audience of the people who were members of San Marco. And you come up the stairs, I'll show you a few views, and it's a fresco on this wall, and it's one of the rare pieces you can actually get. This is Caleb taking a close look. You can get, for scale, you can get really close to this painting. There's a glass, like a glass barrier. It's actually not very high, that glass barrier. Caleb could just reach right over that. But anyway, it's one of the few paintings where you could actually get really close to this work, because typically something like this, like an Annunciation, would be an altarpiece. And so it's just, like if you're especially seeing it in a church, you just can't quite get close enough. And I think I've complained about the Caravaggios also. You can't get into the chapel to get your nose up, probably for good reason, get your nose up close to the Caravaggio. You're kind of leaning all the time, and then in spaces like the Uffizi, of course, you're kind of elbowing with masses of people. But within San Marco, and looking at Fra Angelico's work here, it's you can get so close to it, and there's nobody there, and it's this really remarkable experience. And let me just see. So this is the corridor. So one comes up the stairs, and then you see the painting here at the top, the fresco, and then these would be the monks' quarters. And there are these small doors, and they lead into cells that were the chambers of the brothers in the monastery. And they're very small. They're like 8 feet by 10 feet. So very. This is a rigorously devout order, and like I said, they took vows of chastity and poverty and obedience, and so very sparse living, except for these remarkable sets of paintings and frescoes. So here's the painting in its entirety. And what's happening here, this is a scene called the Annunciation, and it pops up again and again and again in Western art throughout forever. It pops up in Western art forever, post-Christianity. It's a famous story from the Bible. We have the angel Gabriel descending, coming to earth, and he is announcing to Mary, or telling Mary, this is the Virgin Mary here, that she will be the mother of God, that she will give birth to a son who will be the Son of God, essentially. And we're in a space, it's kind of a cloistered area, very sparse interior environment. There is a bit of a groin vaulting happening here, and the small window behind the head of Mary. And there's an exterior garden space and a fence. But does this space not remind you of the corridor itself, and it matches, it's meant to evoke the space of the monastery itself and of the garden that we just passed through to come up the stairs. So Fra Angelico first is putting this narrative, this central narrative, this cornerstone of the Christian faith within a space that the monks would have recognized as their own. So he's bringing this highly important story into the everyday life. You noticed, maybe where should I start? Oh yeah, I have a few details to show you. There's really a like I said, very sparse room. Mary's seated on a stool. She and the angel are making echoing gestures. So again, it's very simple. There's great detail great attention paid to the detailing around the eyes and the face. They're the most detailed part of the painting. The only thing, I think this is so great, my students point this out all the time, in early Renaissance paintings, the angel Gabriel's wings are always multicolored. He has these beautiful wings. And you can actually see when you go to San Marco, and you kind of, depends where you're standing, if you kind of like move around in the space, his wings will glitter. He's painted the wings with a kind of like a mica or some kind of like some kind of reflective stone. And so it's like he has bedazzled wings, okay, guys? And it's lifted from there's something about wings in paradise, and angel wings in paradise being multicolored and beautiful and sparkling, and so they always have this sparse kind of interior, and I love this. It's just very, very simple, kind of pink and blue clothing, and then these magnificent kind of birds of paradise kind of wings. What I'd like to point out to you also, there's a few things, and then I'll start to explain why this may be the case. But notice that the angel, Gabriel, and Mary are slightly too large for the space. So there's something spatially or perspectively not quite working in this painting, or not quite true to life in this painting. Because if she stood up, she would hit her head, right? and the stool, if you look at the stool, the stool is far too large for the room. And so is this door and this window. Like, it doesn't quite look like a rational space to our eyes. And if you notice too, the grass and the fence, they appear to be flattened. It's almost like a flattened world. There's very little I'm talking about perspective, and I'm losing a word. Yeah, depth. We'll go with, yeah, that works. Yeah, very little depth to this space. Now that's gonna drive me nuts. Linear perspective and whatever, it'll come to me, and then we'll come back to it. So very little spatial depth here in this part. There are some shadows in the room, so that he does give us a sense of space and depth through some modeling. So you can see some modeling around that's kind of the shading. You see that shading here around the arches. And then there's some shadow in this back room. But notice that Mary casts a shadow, but Gabriel does not. And so I think it's a metaphor implying that Mary is still of our world, and that Gabriel is of the spiritual world, or of the heavenly world. So there's something metaphorical working, or allegorical working in this space. So we're not viewing reality quite. So there's a few things that make Fra Angelico's depiction of the Annunciation really, really remarkable. And first of all are the lack of accoutrement, so the lack of the stuff. This is a very spare depiction of the Annunciation, which is completely different from actually really any Annunciation painting I can think of from the time. So there's that, and then there's the perspective, which we'll come back to. So this is a much more typical depiction of the Annunciation. This is Simone Martini from just a slightly earlier period. But generally, when we have a depiction of Mary, there's a passage from the Bible saying that she was interrupted, and she's often depicted with a book that she still has her finger, and she's reading the Bible, and it's a way of depicting her devotion to the Word of God. And so it's like Gabriel has like whoosh, like popped up, and she's always looking surprised to see Gabriel, and here in Simone Martini's depiction, she's recoiling slightly from Gabriel. And there's her finger in the book. And there are typically also a vase of lilies, and that's a symbol of Mary's virginity and her purity. You'll be seeing lilies everywhere now. I try to find an Annunciation scene without lilies other than Fra Angelico's. And then here's Gabriel looking much more angelic, I think. Look at his wings again, the colorful wings. But his robe is flapping in the wind. He's just landed, and he's carrying like a laurel leaf, like a leaf of kind of peace and welcome. And then there tends to be also a little Holy Spirit descending down and entering Mary. So the Word of God is coming to Mary. And then in Simone Martini's version, he's gotten even more literal, and he has the words coming out of the mouth of Gabriel. Hail Mary, full of grace, etc., you will bear Jesus. Good luck. Hence her reaction, I think, no. But this is meant for a lay audience. So this is an audience of worshipers, but it's not specifically just for a religious order. So this is for the public at large, the unwashed masses. Here again, this is another version of the Annunciation, slightly later, by Leonardo Da Vinci. Here she is with her finger in a book. You've disturbed me from my reading, she says. Gabriel floats in again with his gesture of benediction, and then there are the lilies in behind. So they're always there. This is slightly farther afield, but I wanted to put it in because I think it's so interesting. We'll have to have a lecture. Maybe this is my little teaser for a future lecture, and then you'll have to come. So this is from an artist in Campen from the Northern Renaissance painting, and his version of the Annunciation. And the Northern Renaissance artists load up their stuff, load it up with symbols. So there are extra symbols here. So once again, we have Mary. She's still reading here. And there's another book maybe that she's in the process of reading. Gabriel has landed with his beautiful wings. There are the lilies on the table. And then, are you ready for this? Up here, there is a little tiny Holy Spirit in the shape of a man holding a cross. Can you see it? Right there. And he's coming in through the window, and he's already, his pre-air, pre-wafting, whatever, has snuffed out the candle, and he's about to shoot into Mary. I love them. They're so literal. Anyway, every little thing in this painting means something. You can analyze these paintings to death. But anyway, that's for another night. But just to show you the usual paraphernalia that would have accompanied an Annunciation painting. And we have none of that here. And we think that that's because Fra Angelico was painting, he was doing this work for a specific audience. And I think that's something that art historians have to take into account often. And I think that's maybe something that gets lost sometimes in art history books. That he was painting this for his fellow dwellers in the monastery, so his fellow brothers. Not a lay audience, this is for a religious audience. And they would know the story already of the Annunciation. They don't need to have the words from Simone Martini spitting out of Angel Gabriel's mouth. They know the narrative. And this would have been almost like a devotional tool that then the monks could stand before it and meditate on this story and meditate on this moment between Gabriel, between God and Mary. So there's less literalism and there's more kind of sparse metaphor that's happening here. What's also unique about Fra Angelico's painting, and I've kind of alluded to this, is that interesting lack of realism or perspective, that we appear to be kind of floating in space. The figures are too large for the area. And what's interesting is that Fra Angelico was at a time during the Renaissance where he knew how to deploy the tools of linear perspective. Because we talked about this artist before, this is Brunelleschi, and he invented and or rediscovered, we're not exactly sure if the ancient Romans figured out linear perspective or not, but he discovered/rediscovered linear perspective because he wanted to draw an accurate rendering of the baptistry in Florence. And I have an entire lecture on this. It's also online, Brunelleschi's Dome. It's a couple lectures ago. And I won't get into this whole story that's on there, but it was an experiment he did to see if linear perspective worked. And what linear perspective is it's a system for depicting the three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface. So if you've taken any art class in high school within the last, I would say, 20 years, they probably taught you how to do one-point perspective. Does that sound familiar to anyone? So it's kind of like, it's like a sense of, you know, here, yes, that's why I had this piece of paper. I'll put this here. This worked out. Oh, it's humming. All right. You'll remember it. So what we have in linear perspective, 1 point linear perspective, is a vanishing point. And that's typically at the horizon. Oops, I missed the vanishing point. Vanishing point down here. Big vanishing point. Vanishing point is at the horizon. And how it works is that we have all of the, it's basically the, like if you were going to draw, you know how you make, oh my goodness, you know how you make graphs, right? There's the x-axis and then the y, and then the lines that come out into our space that's the z-axis, right? Coming out. And so how this works is that if you can imagine a road that's going off into the horizon, or you know when you're looking down the train tracks, and the train tracks look like they go together down into the horizon. So if you had like say you had poles here, and then they would gradually get tinier and tinier. Let's go up here, sorry. And then they get tinier and tinier and tinier and tinier, doop, 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 as we recede towards the vanishing point. And all of the does that kind of make sense? Kind of? Okay, roughly, good. So all of the z-axis lines, there we go. The z's have to obey the vanishing point. And then there's a way to methodologically make sure that it works in the space. Oh, that's so echoey. Okay. Demonstration over. So you can do, artists could then do something like this. So once they figured out the system for linear perspective, the system for the vanishing point, they then could replicate any object that exists in the three-dimensional world. They could render it on a piece of paper or in a painting in a way that you could take measurements from this and recreate that object. So you don't need to have that vase or whatever this thing is. You don't need to have that before you could look at the drawing. So you can make a schematic, right? In a scientific way. And one of the first artists to deploy this system of linear perspective, so Brunelleschi figures it out. One of his contemporaries was named Masaccio. And I mentioned Masaccio really quickly in one of my other lectures, but I was like, oh, this would be a good chance to bring him up again. He's just not quite famous enough to really warrant an entire, I don't think anyone would come to my Masaccio lecture, but well, maybe you might know. But anyway, this is one of the first paintings, or perhaps the first painting, to formally use linear perspective in a correct way. And so what we have here, this is Christ, of course, on the cross with Mary, and then there's God above. But if you can follow the Z lines, there's the Z lines receding into space here. Follow this one down. And the vanishing point is actually at the feet of Christ here. And then so this vault looks like it looks like real space. So the figures are the correct size, they fit within the vault. Not me, an architect or an engineer could take dimensions from this and recreate it. They could make like a 3D model of this thing based on this painting, and then the way that the figures fit within it. So this is a very naturalistic rendering of the world. And there were two side-by-side beliefs or core fundamental driving ideas to the Renaissance. And one was about grace and dignity and balance, but the other was about order and scientific discovery and mathematical precision. And there were artists that followed this line, and then there were other artists that followed this line, and then eventually they kind of come together in the work of someone like Leonardo or Raphael, and then we move into this kind of idea of the High Renaissance, when these two threads, these two ideas become married in the work of, like I said, artists like Leonardo and Raphael. But for an artist like Masaccio, he's driven by orderliness and a scientific rationality to the world, more so than beauty or grace. Would anyone ever use the word beauty to describe this painting? Ooh, no. But it's rational and it's orderly, and again, it's reverential in its attention to, again, kind of this scientific idea of how the world really works. This is another Masaccio painting, but notice the adherence to, again, linear perspective. This is an outdoor scene, so you can't really tell, but the figures look the right size. They're the right size, right, for this space. They look like they could walk through that door. And what I love about Masaccio, notice also he really struggled with halos. How do we show halos in a world of linear perspective? He shows them as little discs. And it looks weird, right? Like they're these floating discs above their head. It doesn't, it's rational and orderly, but it doesn't work as a depiction of kind of grace or harmony or piety, I would say. I love Masaccio, by the way. I feel like I'm giving him a hard time, but I love Masaccio, and that was kind of my issue, that I was more of a Masaccio and Leonardo fan rather than an artist like Botticelli or who are we talking about tonight? Fra Angelico. Oh yeah, there are the discs. Look at that. I mean, they look like little hats. I think they're great. They look like little hats. So keep an eye out for Masaccio and the floating discs. But again, it's like he's trying. You can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to make the halos obey linear perspective, right? And now coming back to Fra Angelico's work, and Fra Angelico, he came after Masaccio and Brunelleschi. He knew they all were operating in the same space, which I've talked about it again and again during these lectures. He would have been very aware of the artistic developments happening in Florence at the time, but he rejects them in an effort to make this painting more pious or more graceful. And so here the halos fit around their heads as they traditionally do in a Gothic painting. And again, the space appears rather otherworldly because it's an act of otherworldliness, right? So again, it's a conscious choice that Fra Angelico is making. And something else also with the size of the bodies and then kind of this odd small door, and that the bodies seem too big for the space, is that here it is, the corridor, it has these little tiny hobbit doors. Like the doors inside San Marco look like they're tiny. I mean, you have to almost duck to get in. So it's a space, it's almost like a topsy-turvy space where maybe you feel too big, or one feels too big to enter through the door. So it makes sense in this space that the figures are too big. And then also when you're coming up the stairs, the perspective is a little more accurate. So when you're looking at it from below and up as one is approaching it, then when we're facing it and how it appears in art books, the perspective looks even more off. But from below, it makes sense, or more sense. So again, it's this essentially you all have to go. You have to go and see it in person. It's basically the gist of tonight's session. So now I'll show you just briefly a couple of so he did a fresco for every single one of these rooms. This is an even more pared down Annunciation in one of the rooms here. Go. There we go. I'm under orders to use my laser pointer more, because apparently it shows up on the video and kids like, use your laser pointer, but it's battling me. So here again we have the angel Gabriel. He's standing this time with his beautiful wings, and the Saint Mark appears often in the fresco cycle as well. But we're in one of the cells almost, but there's an adjoining garden. So Saint Mark is just outside of the space here. But it's a mirror. It's like you could imagine a monk in this space, this very severe space, and they would sleep in here, but they would also come here for prayer and for meditation. And they had, each one of them had a fresco by Fra Angelico upon which to meditate. And they function in the same way that the Annunciation painting functions, is that they're pared down, the narrative is very simplified, and that then compels the monk or compels the friar to then interpret and find meaning in the fresco or in the scene. So here's that Annunciation scene again. Oh, she has a book this time. There she is. This is just another style where I try to give you a sense of the space. One little teeny window, and you can they're all open, and you can go from one cell to the other, ding 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 ding, all the way down. So this is Christ has just left the tomb, but we're once again in this familiar space. It's a garden that's reminiscent of the garden from the Annunciation. It looks like the garden that the monks would have been familiar with inside the cloister. I have to show this one. Caleb and I, neither one of us knew, we weren't familiar with this painting, but this is probably one of his most detailed ones, and so we were going like, it's so contemplative or contemplative, and we're in the Annunciation, and then the crucifixion is very pared down, but then there's this one, which is Christ descending into hell. Here he is to save some souls, some souls. Nope, it's not going. I'm going to point. I'm not supposed to do that either, because then I walk in front of the video or something. Anyway, so there is Christ. He is coming down into hell to save these Christian souls that are in hell. But he's kicked down the door, and there's the broken nail with a little devil being pinned beneath the door. Christ triumphant, kicking down the door with Jesus power. And there's the little devils hiding, and the other devils recoiling, or demons recoiling. But he broke the hinges. That's so great. We think like art history, we're like, this is so serious, what a serious discipline, and I mean it is, and in this serious pious art space, and then it's like God kicking down the door. It's great. Anyway, go look for that one if you're in San Marco. So now I'll transition to Savonarola's story, and why, like I said at the beginning, why I've paired the story of Savonarola with that of Fra Angelico is because, did I put a picture of him? Okay, here we go. Savonarola became the prior at San Marco. So he rose to power in Florence, in San Marco. He's from just outside of Florence, and he joined the Dominican order as the monastic order in the late 1400s, and took vows of obedience and chastity, just like Fra Angelico would have done. But early in his career, he had a series of visions, and he described them as like seven acts. He believed that the church needed to be cleansed and scourged of its sins and its extravagances. And he started preaching this message, and he was often preaching the Book of Revelations, and he would move from town to town to town in northern Italy, and he began to gain a following. He's a very charismatic. Maybe you can't tell from the photo, but he's a very charismatic individual, and he gained a following wherever he went. And he landed at San Marco. He was given the position of as a teacher, and quickly rose to power. And like I said, became the prior of San Marco. And you could actually visit the cells of Savonarola. So he had a corner office in San Marco. It was a diagonal across from Cosimo de' Medici's cells, so the Medici cells. But kind of a larger cell grouping here. And then there are kind of remnants or artifacts from Savonarola's life, which you can see. And there's again, kind of his likeness. And he's one of the, part of the Dominican order is, they would self-flagellate, they would wear hair shirts. So these are again, kind of the remnants of his devotion or of his dedication to the faith. So he was very much like I said, a radical preacher, a charismatic preacher. He drew enormous crowds that he could no longer fill. The church at San Marco overflowed with people coming to hear his message, and he eventually had to start preaching at the Duomo, so at the big cathedral in Florence, in order to allow enough space for his devout followers. And his real adherents became known as the Paglioni, so as the wailers. So they would wail, cry after hearing him, and would follow him about wailing in the streets. And he preached, it was all about, again, the kind of the book of Revelation, so there's this kind of end times and fire and brimstone. He preached against extravagances and against the rich and powerful. He believed that the church had to be cleansed and purified, and the end was imminent. He famously orchestrated what's called the bonfire of the vanities. He did not like paintings like this. He wanted to restrict extravagant lifestyles, and so we talked about this some last week with Botticelli. The renewed interest during the Renaissance in pagan mythology was something that Savonarola did not want and was not interested in the least. And he set up, like I said, this bonfire of the vanities, which happened in the Piazza della Signoria, which is the main piazza in Florence. And he had this roving band of adolescents, of young boys, that would roam about Florence, seizing people's property, so seizing anything that was considered a vanity or an extravagance, so beautiful dresses or extravagant jewelry, paintings like this. And they tossed it onto this inferno called the bonfire of the vanities. He essentially took political and moral and spiritual authority over Florence. He managed to get the Medicis expelled. The slide I'm showing before here, this is Botticelli actually became a follower, which I talked about last week, of Savonarola, and his painting switched from this is nice, Birth of Venus, love, beauty, it's great, with all the flowy hair, to this, which is terrifying. It's a scene from, I have tried to decipher it, it's beyond me, I have to reread the book of Revelations, but look at this. What is this? What is this? Like, it's a scene from the book of Revelations, and there's something very like doom and gloom written up here. Anyway, not important. Essentially, he becomes a radical follower of Savonarola, and essentially stops painting for the last decade of his life. And the story is, we're not exactly, again, this is maybe one of those kind of Vasari stories. We think possibly that Botticelli burned some of his own works, his own pagan works, not this one obviously, we still have this one, on the bonfire of the vanities. Michelangelo left. Michelangelo's like, I'm out. You're on your own, Botticelli. He left and went to Rome. So what happened is that, like I said, Savonarola seized power first in San Marco, then gained enough of a following, was preaching against the rich and powerful, managed to drive out the Medicis, who were basically the de facto leaders. This would be the great-grandson of Cosimo il Vecchio, of the first Medici we were talking about, Cosimo. So this would be the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo tolerated Savonarola for a while. He actually asked for forgiveness from Savonarola at the end of his life. And there's one story that says that Savonarola gave it, and there's another story that Savonarola refused. So the Medicis, I think, were maybe torn between hating this guy, right, because he was taking political control, wresting political control from them. But then also, I mean, they were still devout believers themselves, and Savonarola was a great religious leader. So he did ask for forgiveness at the end of his life, or the final rite. So once the Medicis were out, Savonarola had control of everything. He started preaching. This was a bad move. He started preaching then against the excesses of Rome. It's like the Medicis weren't enough. He was like, must go farther than this. So he starts preaching against this Pope. Oh my goodness, Pope Alexander is right there. I was like, Borgia. Anyway, yes, this is Pope Alexander, who his name is Rodrigo Borgia. So you've probably heard of this. Again, there's movies. Jeremy Irons depicts this guy, right, in true evil fashion, in a series called The Borgias. Anyway, Savonarola probably had a point. This guy was not a good guy. He had many mistresses, many of whom he moved into the Vatican. Just come on in, live in the Vatican with his many children. You've probably heard of Cesare Borgia. I mean, they were just like roaming about Rome and killing all of their enemies and dumping them in the river. And there's a story that Rodrigo had an incestuous affair with his daughter Lucrezia, who's supposed to be beautiful, the most beautiful among beautiful. Who knows? Maybe he did. He was not interested in the papacy as a whole, or kind of furthering the mission of the papacy, or glorifying Rome like Pope Julius did. We talked about Julius before. Rodrigo was interested in Rodrigo, I think, and the Borgia family and their power base. So probably rightly so, Savonarola was like, this is no good. We need to get rid of this pope, and the church needs to be cleansed, and this is a really bad scene in Rome. Then also at the same time, Lorenzo Medici dies, and Savonarola claims that he foresaw the death of Lorenzo Magnificent, so the most important of the Medicis. There is do I have a picture of him? No, I don't. The king of France, the French are invading. The French invade. They cross the Alps and come down into Italy. Savonarola says that they are sent by God to cleanse Italy, to cleanse the church. He lets them walk on by. Go on. You have to go by Florence, right, to get down to Rome. So they head on by. They're like, Savonarola, thanks so much. You stay in charge of Florence. You're doing a great job. So the French let Savonarola remain in power. Pope Alexander, the Borgia Pope, Savonarola has been chirping at him all along about his excesses. He's fine, whatever, do your thing up in Florence. But then Alexander wants Florence. He wants Savonarola to join a holy league against the French. So he wants Florence to come to the aid of the papacy. And Savonarola says, nope, you deserve it. This is the end time. It's coming for you. And Alexander is really, really mad, and he excommunicates Savonarola, which is a really big deal. And the French lose, and that doesn't end well for the French. And it doesn't end well for Savonarola. Don't cross a Borgia, I think maybe is the message here. So Savonarola had bragged that he could walk through fire, that he could face any trial put to him. And in the meantime, though, the Florentines were getting a little concerned about their new religious leader. The Medicis are starting to look pretty good again. He's taking all their stuff. There's the roving bands of the whalers and the little kids stealing all the stuff, which I think is terrifying. I think that's like a little terrifying tidbit. Again, like something right out of Game of Thrones. Just, ugh. So they start to tire of Savonarola, and Savonarola also was preaching heavily against usury and again, accumulation of money and interest. And the Medicis weren't the only banking family. There were lots of banking families in Florence, and they were starting to get tired of the guilt trip. They're like, oh, we don't know. And then when Savonarola gets excommunicated, they're like, oh, maybe this is a really bad idea. Maybe we've picked the wrong side. And Savonarola says, oh, I can walk through fire and I'll be fine. And they're like, oh yeah, prove it. Let's have a bonfire. So they set up a bonfire with a great sense of irony in the middle of the Piazza della Signoria. So this is again that main square in Florence. There's the Duomo and the City Hall, the Piazza della Signoria. This is where Savonarola held his bonfire of the vanities. So then the Florentines have their own bonfire. Here he is. They hang Savonarola along with two of his adherents, two of his followers, until they're almost dead. And then they light the bonfire. And try to walk your way out of this, Savonarola. And of course he doesn't. He burns to death. And they gather up his ashes and they spread his ashes in the Arno River so that none of his followers can sift through the ashes and look for relics. They didn't want him to become a martyr of sorts. And I think too, maybe the story is don't cross the Medicis, because in 1530, who comes to power? Pope Clement VII. This is the papacy. He ascends the papacy. But his name, before he becomes the Pope, before he becomes Clement, is Guido de Giuliano de Medici. So the Medicis are back in power. And Clement sends the papal forces, and then for good measure, the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, so kind of the German area, gets all those guys, takes back control of Florence, because it was still basically, essentially, the followers of Savonarola that held power for about 30 years, still after the death of Savonarola. There were just too many of Savonarola's posse in Florence, and Clement, Guido de Giuliano de Medici wanted the Medicis back in power. So they come up to Florence, they take over, they torture, burn, imprison, or just kill any of the remnant Paglioni, any of the remnant whalers, the followers of Savonarola, and they install a new Medici in power. And this time there is no pseudo-republic nonsense. The Medicis are dukes. And then they move to the Palazzo Pitti, so an even bigger palace, taking control. So then the Medici rule again in Florence. But essentially, the reign of Savonarola marks really the end of the Florentine Renaissance, because many of the artists, they're pulled down to Rome under the influence of Julius II, that pope who was his grand vision for the Sistine Chapel. So an artist like Michelangelo left Florence to go down to Rome, actually to build the tomb for Julius. But artists were being pulled out of Florence, and so again, kind of due to the increase of wealth and prestige happening in Rome, and increasing the power in the papacy, but then also the inhospitableness, I think, of Florence and Savonarola, because it was hospitable. It was hospitable for artists under the Medici, but then it became less so, like you could see with Botticelli, for artists under Savonarola. So there we have it. Oh, and just another kind of tail end to the story. Fra Angelico was beatification. Anyway, that thing. He was given a saintly status, or not a saintly status, a religious status, or a status of like a person of significance within the Catholic faith by John Paul II. They're still thinking about Savonarola. They're not really sure. They're not really sure where to put him. And so up next is Michelangelo's David. We'll be spending the night talking about that, and probably about Donatello a bit as well, and Michelangelo's story and his work in Florence. And that's coming up on the end of the summer, Thursday, August 29th. And then we'll probably move on to something else, some other grand topic. There is in between this date and that date, there is a gallery hop coming up in St. John here, and then we also have one of our openings with. Where is her stuff? Her stuff is at the back. It's kind of her name is Christina Sobstad, and she does really great kind of remote mountainous landscapes. So check for that. We have an events page on our website where we list also all of the lectures. Once again, the donation bucket is at the back. Caleb gratefully accepts any kind of donation by card if you want to do that. And thank you very much, and I'll see you hopefully in a month.